where those who perceive truth may strive to make others see.
A big, powerful America, and shoot them for what?
On that continent, we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other.
I want you to imagine that you're an emperor in China, and you notice that a lot of your people are falling into an addiction to this medication that's being imported from Europe, and you notice this, so you send a formal request for this medication to stop being sent to China. Your requests are seemingly ignored, though. So you begin to punish the smugglers, and you throw out the medication, and all of a sudden, your cities are under attack. Today we're talking about opium and the Renaissance, and we'll be referencing the Opium War by Julia Lovell. And I really want to start this off because I'm not a student of Chinese history, and this particular topic is it dives into a history of a people where a lot of us, there's a lot of, let's be candid, it's just a lot of propaganda about, China in general, right? And I'm not, I've never been to China, I've never, I've heard things from different sources that tell me that, things aren't, all sunshine and rainbows is kind of, we're told on one side, but they're also not, as doom and gloom as we get on the other side of the propaganda. So it's propaganda on both sides. But in terms of the after reading this particular book, you kind of the feelings of China being definitely defined as away from the West in a lot of different aspects. It makes a lot more sense, right? This is, for those that don't know this idea of the Opium War. There was literally in terms of the way China met the West, it was trade was instrumental in this kind of relationship, and this idea of how that really came into being, it has a lot to do. We'll go over a lot, or go over a few things during the actual talk itself, or during the actual segment itself. But I think we get, this introduction. It tells a lot, and I really think that the intro story is it does unfold in terms of in real life. Now, for these guys back in the actual period, and I must say I am very much understanding of what was gone through in terms of seeing this, in terms of this idea. For those that don't know, China's more of an advocate for communism as opposed to capitalism, and the idea is that the West, they don't say communist and capitalist, is the West, they kind of define them as more so imperialist, right? They want to rule the world, and that is certainly hard to that's it's hard to deny that in terms of seeing a lot of really how bullish we've been across the world, and I mean it makes a lot of sense in terms of us not. I don't think it's as black and white as us being the goodies or the baddies in every situation, but we definitely have situations where we are the baddies, and that's kind of regardless of the climate now, like, oh, we're more like socially aware and things like that. We're like the actions, how we're experienced abroad, it's not that, right? Like we get sunshine and rainbows, but they get the reality in terms of a lot of these countries abroad. And this is, I mean, this idea of the Opium War, right? It does kind of paint that picture of really so much of what has kind of come into being in terms of our experience, or how a lot of people will experience us abroad, right? And now, this is, I mean, in terms of this understanding, I think a lot of this is it really, it needs to be understood. Like this idea of the Opium War, a lot of people in China would call this, they're interpreting this as the beginning of what is called the century of humiliation, right? And that is, I mean, it definitely, like, it does not seem like that is hard to draw the conclusion after you see and after you kind of understand a lot of the Opium War and how it took place, right? I feel I'm biting back a lot because there's a lot I want to say, but I really want to start with this idea, or this particular segment, right? So I asked really Claude AI how China was before the Opium War, and this is what it's spitting out. Life in China before the Opium Wars, pre-1839, was characterized by relative stability under the Qing dynasty, though with increasing internal challenges. We'll get into that. And early signs of difficulties to come, right? So we'll like that definitely plays a part. Politically and economically, it goes over some bullet points here. One, China was largely self-sufficient with a well-developed agricultural economy. Second bullet point, the Qing dynasties with a Q, not a K. The Qing dynasty maintained the traditional imperial system with the emperor as the son of heaven. Talk a little bit about the emperor in terms of, well, a lot about the emperor, but of course how that interface with what happened in the book, I think, is very important. The next bullet point: China saw itself as the Middle Kingdom and the center of civilization. Now, this idea of the book was definitely addressed this. I don't think there was a bias in terms of how it addressed a lot of different things, or I didn't sense a bias in terms of how it addressed this particular issue of how China saw itself as, it was white supremacy, and of course in Europe and in China, I think it was more so like there was an element of superiority as well. I'm not sure how deep-rooted or toxic in terms of how it really came about and how the people, experienced it in terms of its neighbors, but definitely something. The next bullet point, we're talking about foreign trade, right? Foreign trade was tightly controlled by the Canton system, limiting the West merchants to conducting business only in Canton, which is Guangzhou, and through authorized Chinese merchants, right? And the government, the next bullet point, the government maintained a trade surplus by exporting tea, silk, and porcelain. They love the tea. They love the tea for sure in Europe. And the next bullet point, the economy was predominantly agrarian with the sophisticated handcraft industry. With the silk is one thing, but in terms of the actual industry itself, I think it's definite. There was definite there was a definite disruption that the people, that the British were definitely able to kind of see in terms of that they were more willing to see in terms of with a lot, or not more willing, but more able to see in terms of the spectrum of human intelligence that the Chinese exhibited, right? So this is definitely this played out in terms of how people seen Britain and how people experienced Britain. Whether or not this was kind of a mass understanding was one thing, but definitely in terms of people seeing this idea of disrupting, an actual, a culture and what's happened here. That was well documented. And the majority of people were farmers, right? And also the idea of social structure, right? So the next bullet point lists this society was organized to Confucian principles with scholar officials at the top, and I think this is definitely like a point that was brought about in terms of you see how this plays out when you do have scholar officials at the top of governments in a lot of situations, and I think and that's definitely something that kind of comes to mind in terms of thinking about how a lot of this actually played out for the Chinese people when they were sending leaders to essentially deal with the war itself, right? Or deal with the elements of what they were hearing about in terms of the destruction and everything that was being heard about. Now, also this idea of extended family networks formed the basis of a social organization. This wasn't something that I particularly tracked onto with the book, but it does kind of make sense in terms of this idea of family systems being central to a lot of ideas of this is kind of, or having your status linked to your family in a lot of different ways. And also this idea of cities were growing also, but the vast majority of the population lived in rural areas, and the majority of people, of course, like I said before, were farmers. And the next point is cultural life. Confucian values dominated education and social norms. Literacy was valued but limited primarily to upper classes. And I'm gonna kind of just run through this because it's taken a while. But traditional Chinese medicine, philosophy, arts, and that continued that was kind of a flourishing, it was just a flourishing moment through and through. Buddhism, Taoism, and folk religion coexisted with state-sponsored Confucianism. And now, the last set of bullet points is about challenges that were on the horizon. The population growth was straining resources. Corruption was increasing in the government bureaucracy. That is huge. We'll talk about that later. The idea of the White Lotus Rebellion as well. Now, this had revealed kind of weaknesses in the system itself, but the early Western contacts, they were creating tension over the trade and diplomatic protocols, right? There was the system in place that kind of told the West how to, trade and what they would do in terms of trade. And also, this is interesting, this last bullet point, and this is kind of the dangers of AI, or I would say kind of links, in my mind, to the dangers of AI, because this last bullet point says opium trade was already becoming a serious and social problem before the wars. And that was, this is something that is, kind of put it, I think, or there's definitely a point within the book which I don't really consider bias in this point in terms of how opium came into China. At some point it did ramp up to where there were opium farmers within China, but in terms of this being a challenge on the horizon, that's something that I think really should be challenged. And that's something that I think is, like I said, is when we talk about AI and how AI really, the function of AI and the dangers of AI, essentially it's going to make it's trying to replace the idea of Google or searching through information, right? And Google replaced libraries, and we got this whole thing, but AI is different in terms of it tells you the information, right? So it does the regurgitation and laying out of information for you, right? And that's the real danger here, because from the understanding that I've gained, this is not like the idea of opium and how it came into China. It was actually grown in India and shipped to China. And this idea of it already being an issue, that was not mentioned in this particular book, and it's something that I would definitely challenge, because when it comes down to, like, if opium is already kind of being made in a place and it's kind of being offered as an import, and if there's any type of stress with that import, there was tremendous incentive as soon as you've seen the demand for opium, right? So why wouldn't there be this explosion of opium farmers within China almost immediately? That's kind of that makes me really question that particular idea. And well, that right there is opium. And the last particular piece, the Opium Wars would drastically disrupt the system, forcing China to engage with the outside world on terms dictated by the Western powers, and that idea is kind of it drastically transformed the way it traded and the way it experienced the West. And we'll go over a few of these things. And and this is, like I said, I'm not particularly a student. I haven't gone over a lot of different elements of China. We went over kind of this period in the 1940s where there was the Great, I forgot what it's called, but it was kind of a starvation period, right? So we talked about that a little bit, and we got into, but this idea of how and what's going on in terms of with the experience here. I really want you guys to understand something. We take China as kind of a, this is one nation, one people. There's the emperor ruled over a conglomerate of people. This wasn't one nation, one people, and that was kind of one thing that was very clear, and kind of really dives into that point of there not being an element of or there being kind of internal bouts within China. And this is very important because when it comes down to this internal conflict, it created unique opportunities for Britain, I would say, to really do what they, to get away with what they've done, what they did in China and what they did with China. And that was it reminded me very much about the idea of look up colonialism and the Renaissance, and the idea of what took place within Africa while they what they did there and how that actually happened. There seems to be a very strong when you have an inside, a defined inside, and it's very powerful in that everybody else can become outsiders, and that is it's like it is strength by the ignorance, and that's kind of what it is there in terms of when it came down to Britain, how they got so much, and really how they became in a lot of cases parasites to the rest of the world, because there was a defined inside, right? And I don't know about really the actual society and how China would treat different neighbors, but in terms of the British and the way they did, it seemed like they were very good at kind of, or they were able to take advantage of the idea of everybody else being outsiders, right? And this right here is interesting because that's how like I was saying, they broke up. That's how they broke up and conquered a lot of Africa, right? There were nations within Africa that were saying, hey, trying to get British to develop their own lands, and basically probably treating them like, hey, look, I'm not really quite as, and treating them as just people, and just saying, oh, okay, well, these guys, we kind of have a bad history, in not understanding that the way Britain sees these people is, okay, let me let me use that to essentially leech off of this entire land, and eventually now you have mines and everything like that owned. And it's interesting because the parallel, it drew a lot of I drew a lot of it from that idea, but the people themselves, this idea of Confucianism, it was this kind of overarching religion, but everybody had their own practices underneath, and I mean that it did that idea of it not having a defined system. It helped in terms of create that internal conflict and have that in terms of like that strife between people, right? Because when we think about the wars that were fought, they're all, a lot of the wars are based on religion, right? And this idea of not having a one religion rule them all, it's like that I would call that's like having one religion to rule them all. That's a mass psychosis, I would call that. But not having that it became a weakness in this particular case, in terms of this particular conflict. And this is in terms of this idea of, when it makes me think about the Renaissance, I think we do need to understand that we need to develop the strength without the mass psychosis involved in terms of one religion to rule them all. And I think that's going to be very, very much the concept of when we talk about moving into the future of anything. We need to have that understanding that there will be different forms and different expressions. I am for those that don't know, I study a branch of astrology called zodiacal alchemy, right? So, but having that understanding of what maybe Sagittarius rule, right? So Sagittarius rules over things like religion and things like that, right? But it also rules over things like principles and and kind of higher knowledge and things like that. Having a healthy society, I would say, is going to be dependent upon having various outlets for that Sagittarius actual when we talk about how people satisfy this particular pressure that the universe puts on us, right? So having that in terms of going into the future is going to be, I think, extremely important. And this is going a bit off, but I think it's important because it's kind of like I stopped. I was daydreaming a lot throughout seeing different points in this particular book, and that's the idea. We have to realize and understand the significant failure of, for instance, I would say one of the symptoms that we'd see nowadays is the idea of homeless people, poor people, that would be ruled by this element of particularly Pisces, but there's significant overlap between Sagittarius and Pisces in terms of they're ruled by the same planet, and Pisces would rule over things like prayer. Sagittarius would be more like formalized religion, but the idea of not having various outlets for Pisces, Christianity trying to hold Pisces captive is a problem and it creates that particular idea of this is it's either us or nothing, or like for a lot of people, that's how they'll experience it, even though we kind of don't limit people from, going out and finding different things if they're more so motivated. But having that is, having this being in your face is pretty significant for a lot of people, or it's going to be significant in terms of the, I'm thinking about an energy diagram where, like, making it but the idea of another religion besides Christianity. It seems like a lot of like hardcore Christians or not hardcore Christians, but I'll say more toxic Christians are more so interested in the idea of increasing the energy required to get to any other religion. Like it's very much a problem, and there's a lot of different ways they do that, including things like what's essentially saying essentially like criminalizing Muslims off the rip, and kind of mass spying operation, or mass spying with different types or different sects of particularly Muslims, because of the whole 9/11 incident, and criminalizing the different languages and things like that. But this is important because we need to understand, and also which is funny because Pisces would also roll over things like drugs, and that idea of how and why people would go into drugs could, I would say, certainly be a symptom of the same thing, right? So homelessness and drugs are all, like, these are Pisces phenomena, and when you don't have a society that exercises healthy options for Pisces, you simply, I would say, you see more of this, and very much like this is like I said, this is zodiacal alchemy, right? So every astrologer doesn't practice the same exact type of astrology, I'll say, right? So this is, I think, in terms of what we see here, how we can, what happens here, very much something worth ranting about. Now, in terms of when it comes down to this idea of the Opium War, this is not a one-off event, and this is not, like some people would say, this is kind of segmented into two different segments. And I think that's based on really the results or the outcome of, the treaties that were signed, or the results of kind of opening up China more to different forms of trade and things of that nature. But this isn't a one-off. Either way, we don't have, it's not a one-off event, right? So we have this particular book that was, by Julia. This is one, this is the first Opium War, or defined as the first Opium War. And this idea of the actual war itself, this is, we don't, the interpretation of war and how we, like I said, it's the results, but also you kind of have an understanding that this isn't necessarily like this wasn't at the time, this was simply the British opening, like the British attacking cities based on being essentially just being told no, with the idea of what was going, what they were trying to put into the cities, right? So the idea was there was a consensus that, or the emperor, I'll say, banned the idea of opium imports from Europe. And I mean, the idea is that opium, that money that the British got from selling opium, that was, I mean, it was addictive to the British. They needed that. And it's very, very much, it's hard to imagine any type of argument against the idea of this being very much shameful to really just the British people in general in terms of what took place. But the idea of really how this started was there's a figure, and this particular figure in China, I'll say that, and the only reason why this figure particularly is important, I think it's Lin Zexu, I want to say, and I probably am slaughtering that name, but when it comes down to what we'll say Lin did, came and he threw out buckets or chests of opium, right? So shipments of this huge shipment of opium came in, and he threw it away into the ocean. And I mean, it's hard to think, but these guys were really, they're like, hey, who's gonna pay for this? And that kind of became a significant part of really this argument of what happens, right? There was a lot of there wasn't really a solid acknowledgement with the British people that they just wanted opium. They just wanted to essentially be the biggest drug dealers in the world, but that was it. They really like this right here, this particular event, this kind of started everything of being more hostile. Of course, that now before this particular thing took place, the British were told, like, hey, look, we don't want opium here, we don't want you guys importing opium. And the Chinese were even like, they were essentially like trying to just making displays to the British to essentially kill to execute opium smugglers in front of where the British could see. And this idea of what took place is crazy in terms of having these particular people and what they did. That was they, after having opium, they were being they were clearly told, like, hey, look, we don't want opium, and they threw out the opium, and they were just they essentially said, hey, look, man, who's gonna like, I'm trying to imagine you throwing out your kids, you found drugs in your kids whatever, and you throw it out, and he's telling you, like, hey, look, this idea of you throwing out these drugs is I understand. But who's gonna pay for this? I'm like, what? Are you serious? This is an argument? But I mean, that's essentially what started it. They just seemed like a bunch of that's exactly how they seemed. They seemed very, very much like, oh, this has to be paid by somebody. And this idea of this campaign, they the Chinese, that like there wasn't a consistency, there wasn't a solid consensus that there was, I don't even like they were under attack by this nation. In fact, there were like like they would attack one city and trade with the next in that particular idea, right? So there wasn't a solid consensus of, oh, this is war, which I think kind of gives credence to the response, because a lot of, like, when it comes down to the response here, this idea of, I would say, being led by, I would say, scholars and intellectuals, and having them on the top tier, there was kind of a comfort, right? So this is taking place well after kind of the, when I would I'll say there's a trope, right? Or there's some kind of analogy where, or some kind of thought process where one generation experiences war, the next generation kind of, reaps the benefit of not being in war, and the next generation is just completely inept with, like, war in general. And it seemed like that's where a lot of these people were, all right? Because you have things like Genghis Khan and what happened there in terms of the particular being understanding of what conflict looks like on a massive scale. These people, like, at this particular point, there wasn't that understanding. That was not ingrained in these people, and they were sending scholars to deal with scholars who have never seen combat, who've never had, like, any semblance of combat, and or into these particular situations, not understanding that, oh, we're at war. And the response was, it was just essentially like, oh man, these guys, like imagine somebody who doesn't know what war is coming to see, like, oh, this is war. Like, there was no real response with these particular situations, in these particular ideas of, like, oh, this is what happens here. This is how we, stop these people. Now, it was just like, oh, I'm gonna stop these people in the name of China with these, grand statements and things like that. And they just, you just sending, like, people, like, at some point there was, there were people who were, like, descendants of like great warriors, and it was just like, oh, these people must be great warriors. And it was just like, no, they're, like, sitting in a room, like, reading books all day. They don't really know anything about war, but they were sent, as if, like, oh, okay, we need to put a stop to these people. And there was no, like, there was not a solid consensus, like, this was a war. And that was all through. And in terms of this idea of, the century of humiliation or whatever, that's kind of like people turn. It makes sense because, after kind of understanding and, having, that type of invasion happen, and you're not coming to that realization until late, and you kind of do have these figures come up to say, hey, look, enough is enough, and we do need a more solid and rigid system, or a more solid and rigid interaction between us and them. And that's it makes a tremendous amount of sense, the idea of a lot of different campaigns, how the role of the government kind of essentially coming into in this particular book, they mentioned how people and students would essentially see things and they wonder, oh my goodness, like, or they would like kind of think like, or not think, but literally express like, okay, the Chinese government didn't see that this was propaganda and they didn't stop this. Why are they, are they not doing their jobs? And it was just like, okay, well, like you kind of have that understanding that, or that these are the people that come into power and that come into place, to where like they'll create that buffer, right? So as the government and the new government, and how they would particularly interact with the rest of the world will come as a byproduct of this shell that was formed as a result of this, right? Because like after this, I'm imagining like war generals like just looking at that and just being like, oh, like absolutely. Now I'm gonna spare the explicitives here, but just no, absolutely not. No, we're not dealing with this anymore, and becoming much more rigid and seemingly toxic to the rest, to a lot of places. This is I can that formulation of of thought actually created what we experience now in terms of quite literally, right? So this is still referenced in terms of with a lot of different campaigns. There was actually a point to where they're mentioning this. There was a mass protest and riots about a lot of things, but it came up under some kind of. There was some kind of what is it called? The date, where the date comes around. Why am I forgetting that? I don't know. But the date comes around, and the anniversary. There was an anniversary, a special anniversary that took place during these protests, and it calmed things down dramatically because it was a protest around. It was a protest around essentially just equal rights, fair pay, whatever. But that idea of that anniversary coming around and introducing people like, okay, this is, people were simply sitting, like they were able to sit back and say, okay, well, this is how we kind of experienced a lot of these other different concepts. Let's, calm down with a lot of, with something that was, essentially they were up in arms about, that became a topic, that became the topic, and it did stop a lot of protest. And this is, like I said, like you go and you see, or you read the what happened in a lot of these cases, and you're thinking like, damn, yeah, absolutely, it makes sense. Like I couldn't imagine. I could not. I am not surprised at all about how how China will interface with the rest of the world now, and it makes sense. You can't be militant minded and look at that and think like, okay, we're gonna be nice now. we're gonna play nice with these people. That does not happen. That does not happen in any society, period, I think. And this is very much makes sense. This idea of there's a lot more here than I really thought about in terms of how to segment this. I really don't want to segment this in 2 segments, and I'll try not to. But this idea of the how this started and played out, and what's been happening. This internal conflict was very real in a lot of cases, and the proliferation of opium was it it was the actual the actual addicts themselves, in terms of actually seeing the effects of opium and being, kind of being taken out the competent side of society in a lot of cases. And sometimes you have, of course, you have like functional addicts which are able to do stuff, but a lot of cases these guys are just completely, you when you become addicted, you see that. And there were essentially towns that were close to the trading grounds that were just, like, they were like, they seen the effects drastically. It seemed like this wasn't something that was isolated in any way for these people. This was very much real and in their face with a lot of the stuff, and they were calling this stuff medicine. They were saying, while this was going on in China, where you're seeing towns like kind of really being affected. In Britain, they were saying, "Oh, this is medicine." like they were saying, like, "Oh, this is." If there is something like an opium addict, it might be like every now and then. like they were trying to sell this to the people, and it's so crazy because you find out later, later on, there's like trade opens up between like China and Britain, and the Chinese come to Britain, they open opium dens, and the Britain they got the nerves. I think that idea of like they were saying like, oh, these people, these opium dens, they're poisoning us. Like, really? Like, I'm like, are you serious? Like, this is I don't even know what kind of mental jujitsu you need to do to come out your mouth and say that, but they were just literally like, oh, these opium dens are, there, and there's a tremendous amount of problem we'll definitely get into with that, in terms of how the British society met with and intermingled within with Chinese in general. But that idea was crazy, but they were lying. They were just straight up, oh, this isn't even a big deal. And they were able to, kind of just placate the people and pacify them to, oh, this, they're just, this idea of, us being told, not to bring this is total inflation of what the issues are. And, that was one element of allowing this thing to continue. Another was there was a legit a lot of officials, there was it, in terms of the interface. It seems like there were a lot of officials that were just being paid off, right? So the addicts were one thing, we talked about that, but the actual officials that allowed this, they were I'm surprised bribes weren't even I'm surprised bribes weren't taxed at this point, the way that this was happening, right? Because this was, it's almost like it was embedded in the culture of being able to say, hey, look, we're gonna let this stuff through, and just being able to wash the right hands. And it was very, very it was very much an issue, because the response to banning opium, it was half-hearted, it seemed like, right? A lot of these people were just like, hey, sure, we'll get rid of opium. And these are the same people who accept bribes by different smugglers to get opium, and there's a situation to where they brought up where how they were getting rid of, this is when the Chinese started growing more opium, and they were getting rid of like opium fields, but they weren't burning, or they weren't getting down to the roots of opium, in terms of they weren't burning, or they weren't getting rid of the root, they weren't pulling the plant from the stem, right? So opium comes from the poppy plant, I believe it is the poppy seed plant or whatever, but they weren't taking the root itself. They were just simply going and chopping at the tops, and it was this allowed for this to proliferate more through society, and really had a tremendous impact on how long it stayed in society, I would say. And there's also, and another element is the people on the ground who were brought, but also the people who were able to kind of benefit on just wealthy merchants who were able to benefit on the sale of opium and how it was being sold. These people had, there would have been a much more drastic response if these people didn't have the ear of the emperor in a lot of cases, and they were essentially able to say like, oh, this is, maybe this is not so bad, and it was definitely something. Now, in terms of these particular battles or skirmishes, right? Because this does not appear like I said, this does not appear like one-off event to where there's a long, drawn-out war. It just appears like a series of different skirmishes and battles that took place, and it's just, it's crazy to think that this was, allowed to this extent. But in terms of this particular idea, a lot of times the leadership was blaming traitors, and that became kind of a theme, to blame the traitors, and that did not help, because the idea of, oh, we're going to, address this particular problem, it did not help solidify one side against another side. It simply said, okay, well, imagine you're on the front line and you're thinking about, well, is everybody on my side? You're looking behind you like, okay, maybe these guys might betray me or run or something like that, when you have that particular, when it comes down to the psychology of these actual soldiers, they did not have an actual understanding of, oh, this is how, this is one side against another side, and that solidified thought created, I would say it created a lot of opportunity with when it came down to how what the British were able to do. Now, this is, this wasn't an unfounded, kind of how China experienced, or how China kind of broadcasted the idea of quote unquote traitors. A lot of people, a lot of leadership in China was, corruption. It was a theme. Opium didn't just magically start the corruption. There's actually corruption within a lot of places to where, or a lot of upper echelon to say oh, okay, this is there were people in society that were looking. Now there's two segments here. People in society were looking okay, these are kind of our saviors that are going to help us with, these, very, essentially just corrupt leaders, right? But also an element of when when China kind of, or when the leadership in China would say something like, okay, this is, let's kind of tell people what's happening and broadcast the idea of what's happening. There were some pretty stark scenes of cities being on the edge of being taken over, and just families like committing mass suicide, and that right there is like, I mean, it was very, very dark. I had to I had to look away from from reading in some cases, because it's just like there was some pretty messed up situations to where these the hopelessness that a lot of these guys were experiencing wasn't it was ugly, these guys were when they took over, when they took over a city, and they were able to see families take it into their own hands in terms of not being in a position, or take it into their own hands in terms of how they would deal with things on that scale. It was very much, I'm pretty sure it was not easy, but the idea of it felt it was a strong response, I would say. And like I said, I couldn't think in terms of the idea of being I think now you're thinking, we're looking at going into March. We have our presidential, our president or our people talking about this particular administration in America is talking about going into Gaza and owning Gaza. And I think about using, weaponizing our military in kind of conflicts that don't have honor in any way. There is no particular there is no semblance of coming out of any of that situation and feeling like there's a win. And the the idea of these guys going into to do things and experiencing that, I would say that I think it's really kind of it contributes to the PTSD, right? When you don't have that semblance of we're not really fighting anybody here. This is it robs these people of a semblance of purpose, right? The people who quite literally say we're gonna put our lives on the line, and then come to realize oh, this is actually monstrous. We're essentially just doing monstrous things here. I think that does contribute significantly to the PTSD and the idea of what we experience in terms of what we experience in terms of at home when our soldiers return, and the depression that really builds up. And I think there's, of course, elements to where it doesn't matter if the guy is shooting at you. If there is an enemy it does matter. There is an element of people having that particular enemy that is shooting at you, a solidified enemy that you want to go after. I think that's that's an element as well, but having and coming to realization that you're not doing anything like the people who went to Vietnam is, for instance, the people in this particular conflict. I imagine that's pretty stark to come into contact with that, even having to explain that particular story of, oh, these families decided to commit suicide, and that was like that's not easy to explain. Now, in any case, this idea of the how and what took place, it ended with a treaty, right? And this treaty was essentially expanding the influence that, or the actual trade that took place between Britain and China. Now, this idea of expanding the trade and how it was portrayed to the people, this was sold, or this was, bottled up and sold to a lot of the people in Britain as, we are opening these people up to the rest of the world, right? So this is like we're helping, we're helping them, expose them to the rest of the world and our civilization. And this is I'm reminded of the idea of like a lot of meme coins are coming out now, right? So the idea is it's a scam, but I think a lot of people are essentially like saying, or basically trying to sell to their audience, like, oh, we're actually helping expose these people to, or get these people into crypto. And it is insane, because it's just like, okay, well, what are they gonna think about the rest of, in this case, what are they gonna think about the rest of the world now? Like they like, oh, I just, like these people like saying now, like, oh, I lost all my money in crypto, and now they're saying like, oh, I lost all my money in like in this idea of or I'm being extorted, or or just basically just being taken advantage of by Britain. Let me trade with let me trade with other nations in Europe or something like that. It's crazy, but this was how they, this was a lot of how they sold it. And after everything, this particular treaty, it wasn't even like, it wasn't enough. Like the Chinese were not happy with them in terms of the local Chinese were kind of like, after this particular skirmish, which is now known as the First World War, or after these particular skirmishes, they weren't happy with them. They weren't trading with them as much. They started growing their own opium in a lot of cases, and the first time they had like kind of plausible deniability with the leadership in Britain to say like, okay, well maybe like this isn't really about opium and drugs and us being drug dealers, and it came down to, hey, we're actually not making as much money now. We got a problem, and Britain saying, you know what, let's open up, let's see what we can do, and basically just start this second war to gain more access to more trade with China and more of their rivers and stuff like that, and try to like really infiltrate China with opium, essentially, right? And they kind of had to come to a more conscious understand, or more they had to really admit to what they were doing in the second piece of this particular war. And that's crazy, because it's crazy that they did this, because it's just like they attacked, they basically attacked China and got what they wanted, because you don't really like this group. They weren't they weren't really militarily ready for what the British were. I mean, in terms of being like absolute parasites of the world, the British were great at that. And going into different lands and different places, that's what they did, and they were trying, and they were like, there's a warship that they had, particularly, that was really just causing mass chaos. Like, they were able to just destroy a lot of pieces of their defense through this particular like warship or whatever. But in any case, they attacked again, and it was successful to say, like, okay, we're going to expose them to more trade, and eventually they got it. They got more trade. And this was and this was how China really experienced a lot of Europeans through this particular lens. And this became, they had an anti-Christian sentiment in a lot of places in China, to where even though it was now legal, quote unquote legal, for these mercenaries to go through and do what they did, even though some of these mercenaries were also smugglers, which is really hilarious. But these mercenaries, they come in and they'd say things like, or they'd basically, get like attacked in certain situations, and there was kind of a movement kind of brewing. It didn't seem to have significant root in China, but there was a movement, and it was broadcasted. It was broadcasted to China, or to Britain, about this movement, to where Britain, like, they overreacted with how they dealt with, Chinese immigrants, and it was, in terms of how they treated Chinese people, the opium dens, one thing, right? So when they started open opium dens, they, of course, it was like, okay, this is a plot. This narrative, the Chinese people are plotting to poison us, and this particular idea, this idea, it manifested in the thoughts, and also in the actual literature, in the media in Britain. There was actually kind of a was it a trope, I'll say, to where they had this Chinese supervillain, and the idea is that this supervillain is really all about biochemical warfare and poisoning the British people, or and that was the thought process there, right? They wanted to and it's so funny because one of the people who was like really, really famous for a lot of this literature, I forget his name, but at some point he's just like, oh, I don't know anything about China. like I have no clue. I have no clue anything about China. I just know what sells. That's it. And it was just like, hey man, look, I'm like, this idea, I don't know, the picture that I have in my head, which is crazy because this is like a villain that's kind of, I think, I mean, even in China they would kind of keep this theme going in terms of this particular villain, but it's just like this guy who has a long beard, right? He has a long beard, he has a long chin beard or whatever. He has long nails, an old guy or whatever, and he's the villain. Like, he's the villain that's going to poison everybody. And that was, they had series to where they kept this guy as the villain and doing like just insane crazy plots, like, oh, I'm gonna like put poison in my cat's nails and wait till it scratches people and stuff like that. It was crazy, but this like it sold in Britain, and they were able to get that get that idea out there to proliferate Britain. And that was very, very like in terms of being a Chinese immigrant in that particular climate, couldn't imagine it. But there was one guy, I would say one guy who's mentioned in this book who I think really there's a I think that guy, I would say, I have a lot of I think respect for how he was betrayed, if that's not how he actually lived itself. It was just like, hey, let's he seemed to go through this idea of, all right, what are the problems that led to us losing and really losing the Opium War, and how do we fix that? What are the problems with, or what are the good things about our society and the good things about this society, and what are the bad things about this society and the bad things about our own society? And that guy, he went through a surgical precision to say it, like, to really be brutally honest about, like, okay, this is what we need to do, or this is what happened, this is what needs to happen, and stuff like that. And one of the really big primary explanations they had was that China had weak intellectual leadership, and this was kind of proliferated through the news and stuff like that. There was no strong. I'm not particularly sold on this idea of strong intellectual. Well, maybe I am on strong intellectual leadership to being a solution, or to leading a solution, but weak intellectual leadership I'm not quite sold on. But that idea of him going through and trying to figure out what our problem was, I think the media has a tremendous impact, and it had a tremendous impact in terms of with it seems like with the actual idea of how the Chinese dealt with Britain in general. And I would say now, in terms of this idea of this idea of a renaissance, I would say it does have to do with I would say strong intellectual leadership. Now we don't have that. We have we have people in power who are like I said, we're in 2025 now, coming into March. The new administration, like Trump just ran a meme coin on his audience, to where that's a net, like, if those people involved in that's a net loss in terms of the majority of them. That is, unless you bought them, I think I heard unless you bought this coin within the first 2 hours, that's a net loss. Like, you're looking at a net loss. And I mean, every single, all these conservative media heads and shit, and things like that, they're not saying anything about that. That's not there's not even a peep about it, right? I'd have more respect for them if they said things like, oh, okay, well, maybe we're gonna do this with Trump coin, or do that with Trump coin, and stuff like that. They're not even addressing it, because it's more important for them to stay in line than for them to actually it's more important for them, when I say stay in line, it's more important for them to be, say, pro-Trump than to be anti-establishment. And that is a tremendous problem now, right? Because it's like, I never identified myself as a MAGA person. I don't think that's, I have my own way to, or my own like kind of understanding of society, and that didn't quite, I have my own kind of nitpickings about things. But that right there, that idea of, okay, we're going to be for the working class and essentially not say anything when this particular working class is just outright robbed. I mean, by the leading person. That's crazy. That's insane. And that is, if we're talking about weak intellectual leadership, that's the idea. That is, I think that right there is exactly it. People not saying anything and people not being willing to say anything, and people essentially tiptoeing around that particular idea of what's going on now. And on the other end, it's the same idea, I would say, right? Because there is now, on the left, it's not like Trump won for no reason. People on the left were not willing to address a lot of the, a lot of what took place on the left that just was simply not going to be agreed upon by vast majorities of this society or other societies across the world. It just was not going to be a thing. It wasn't like, this wasn't going to be a society coming into acceptance for a lot of this stuff. That right there, it's the same thing. Weak intellectual leadership, strong intellectual leadership. They're willing to say, "Hey, look, this is where we stand here, and when you do something wrong, I'm not on your side. I'm on the side of right. So whether you've said things that are right and that I agree with, that is one thing. When you do things that are wrong, that is going to be exactly what it is. I'm going to treat it exactly what it is, and we're going to be surgical about this. I'm not going to try to deify figures or people. We're just going to address case by case what happens. And if I offend the new administration, then that's what it is. But the actual surgical addressment of that stuff, it does require restraint. And that guy, coming back to the story, that guy really showed that. That guy was really willing to, essentially go out and say, like, hey, look, this is how we can correct things now, and and essentially message and create this message to or create this kind of blueprint for how to fix things, right? A real blueprint. And this is, I think, how we move forward. A real blueprint, real people coming together and doing things, and not necessarily trying to be on one side than the other, right? This whole bipartisan thing, there's people at the top, like there's people, I would say, like what do you call it, like the tech giants, I would say, they're on both sides. They don't care who wins, right? Like they like in terms of this society, I went oh, okay, well, Trump's winning. All right, you I gotta make sure that I'm like really not using profane language here, but it's just like, you already coddle up to power, Like, who has that power? That means nothing to you. Like, you know that you coddle up to whoever's in power. That's your morals and that's your principles. That is the extent. You will do whatever it takes. So it's just like this idea of this new leadership, like you know, like we need that. We do need that. We do need what I would say is strong intellectuals to come in and say, hey, look, or be willing to say what it is, and you know, and really tell people how things are, because this is not it, right? Like these people who are kind of quote unquote truth tellers, like a year or 2 years ago, they're the people who are now coddling up to the you know, the whole Trump administration now. They're not going to keep it straight with you. They're going to be pro-Trump. They're never going. It's not about being anti-establishment anymore. It's about being pro-Trump, and that's kind of where we're going now. So I do have a lot of respect for this guy, in general. This idea of we really need to understand that this who China is now, it does have that roots, right? Where they're at now, how they interface with the rest of the world, it does have kind of roots, I would say, into us not having intellectuals that say, this is what we did, and this is why things are the way they are. And those people being brought, when they do happen, when they happen, when I say strong intellectuals, it may not be, they may not have good takes in every situation, but in one situation or another situation, those things, you know, like I'm sure Hitler had some phenomenal ideas about something, you know, like maybe those ideas do need to be heard. His idea about what to do with different populations in society, maybe not so much. Like, let's tone that down a little bit. But that right there, that idea is something, or that idea of kind of being surgical, it does need to be in the populace as well, right? So people in general, they need that in terms of the people who are, I would say, in the media spaces, or need that, but also the populace as well, and also keep them accountable, and make sure they are accountable. And that right there, this is, I think, this wasn't as long as I thought, but it is pretty long still. If anything, I'm going to say that's going to be the end here. And I really want you guys to understand that what's happened in the past, looking at that now, is something that's going to have to be incorporated into understanding where this Renaissance leads us. This is not something that we can blanket ignore and go into kind of this rainbowish future. There is a past. We can't ignore it. The way we move into the future is by understanding it and being able to really look at that head on before going into the future and moving into the future. And please, by all means, like, subscribe, do the YouTube stuff. Subscribe if you're on podcast, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.